to fix that. Let's jump back to the beginning, and I'll try to start over. I'm hoping it's working now. I did change a few settings there, and so hopefully that is now working. Someone let me know if it is, and we will try to start over. Sorry about the issues. Give everyone a few minutes to see if that starts working. Again, I apologize. If you can hear me now, I'm going to kind of just reiterate. We're going to talk about Abraham and talking about this idea from back in the day of what would Jesus do. But we're going to use different Bible characters as we go through the series, and so this is going to be what would Abraham do. Let's jump back to the beginning, and I'll try to start over. All right. It's working now. I appear to be having sound on my end now, so hopefully that's working better for everyone. That is now working. So, this idea from Genesis chapter 12 is a good place to start for what would Abraham do, right? And so at this point he's just Abram, but he gets this call from God, and it says, we'll just kind of summarize this since we're kind of behind because of the sound issues. It says, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land. Let me flip over to there, I'm sorry. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Right? So he gives them this promise: well, I'm going to make a great nation of you. So I got the heads up that it's now working from someone besides myself. So I appreciate that. Hopefully that's working. So Abram is called in Genesis chapter 12. This idea from Genesis chapter, and then in Genesis chapter 15, he kind of gets a covenant from God. So at this point, he's called and he tells him how it's going to look. And it says, so he tells him, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram. I am your shield. The Lord shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. Right? So he's like, you've promised me these things, but I don't know, so that you will really understand how this logically lines up. Right? And so he said, behold, you have given me no offspring. A member of my house will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. So he kind of takes it a step further and gives him a little bit more information about the promise. And he brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are even able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord and counted it to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, bring a heifer 3 years old, a female goat, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half against the other. But he did not cut the birds of prey. And when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, so he said, behold, you have the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on him. And behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. So he's telling, he's giving a little bit more information about this. He brought him outside and said, look, he's saying, this is, I'm making this covenant with you, with these animals to show you, for real, right? That this, and he said to him, I'm the Lord. He said to him, I'm the Lord. And so, but he said, O Lord God, but he said, O Lord God, how am I to? Picking up again there in verse verse 15, I believe. Yes, verse 15. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites, right? All these land. He's describing, this is what you're going to get. This is what you're going to possess. And so, he makes this covenant, right? So he calls them in chapter 12. He makes a covenant, this promise in chapter 15. And then in chapter 17, we get another covenant, right? Another sign for Abram. So I'm not going to read quite as much here. Chapter 17, Genesis chapter 17, starting in verse 15. And God said to Abram, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Then Abram fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abram said to God, oh, that Ishmael might be for you. God said, no, but Sarah your wife will bear a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. And when he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Right, so then he gets this sign that you're going to have a child from Sarah. So in chapter 16, which we skipped over, he decided, hey, I'm going to kind of accelerate this process. I'm not really happy with the way God's doing it and the timing he's doing this in. So they decided that Abram would sleep with his servant Hagar, and that she would bear a son, which is where Ishmael came from. And God said, nope, I know that's your son, but it's going to be yours and Sarah's son, right? And so he's kind of doubling down on this promise. This is going to happen, and this is going to be from you and from Sarah. And Abraham laughs, right? He goes, are you serious? How is a 100-year-old man going to give birth or have a son? And how is a 90-year-old woman going to give birth? And they just laughed about it to God. But God was faithful, right? God was calling them to do something in the beginning, and he is giving them the sign and saying, it's going to happen. I promise you. Just keep believing. So then we skip over Genesis chapter 22. At this point, there has been a son that has been born to Sarah and to Abraham, and his name is Isaac, right? And then in chapter 22, God makes this crazy request of them and says, hey, you should go sacrifice your son Isaac. Remember, he just promised them to have offspring. They finally have offspring, and now he's asking them to sacrifice their child. So pick up verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abram rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose, and went to the place of which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abram took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And so they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father," he said, "here I am, my son. Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. And when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son, right? Verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abram went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your one and your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offering shall possess the gate of his enemies, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. So a couple observations from this text, right? We have the call, we have the promise, we have the sign and the sacrifice, right? And so from all those four texts, what would Abraham do, right? What does Abraham do in those moments? Before kind of we get there, just want to recap for those of you that may have been joining late or because of the technical difficulties that I seem to always have when we do the live stream. So I apologize for that. But so Abraham's called and said, "Hey, you're going to have all these offspring, the nation, you're going to go to this land and I'm going to give you the nation and your offspring's going to populate it and really populate the whole world." And then after the call, he promises him to, he makes a covenant with Abraham and tells him, "This will be your child," right? Don't get ahead of yourself. Just because you think it's going to be someone within your camp, it's going to be your child. It's going to come from your body, or your wife's body, and your offspring as well. And so he makes a covenant with him, right? He cuts up the animals, puts them there, passes between them, and says, "Hey, you can know this is true because of me doing this." And then in chapter 17, there's this covenant of circumcision, right? And a second covenant. We didn't really read that part. But then later on in chapter 17 is this promise again, right? Hey, this is gonna, I know you tried to do it your own way and have a child with your servant Hagar, but this is gonna be your child and Sarah's child. And it's gonna come from you guys, right? And then he laughs at God and says, "Really? 100-year-old man, 90-year-old woman? Well, we'll see if that's gonna happen." Right? And then the child finally is born, right? And we get to chapter 22, and God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, which is this crazy request, right? We just think it's insane that this is what he's been hoping for all this time, and now that's going to be taken from him. But it was really this testing from God to see if Abraham trusted God in that moment. And so then this is it's crazy when you think about Abraham. He's this giant of faith, and later on he's even written about in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11 verse 8, it says, by faith, right? This is like this Hall of Fame chapter. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going, right? Which kind of gets us to our first point here, and that is that God's call often asks us to leave comfort and security and go into the unknown, right? Genesis chapter 12, he's calling him to this unknown place. He's leaving his security, right? It says he had wealth, he had riches, he had cattle, he had land, he had servants, he had all this stuff, and he's potentially leaving all that behind. So one observation is God's call will often ask us to leave comfort and security and go into the unknown. A second thing is that location, likelihood, logic aren't really factors in God's calling, right? Location, he's like, you're going to go to the land of Canaan, which was far away. I did a little bit of research this afternoon, and anybody else out there that can correct me if I'm wrong, but Canaan was 400 to 600 miles away from where they were before. And so it's not like he was just moving around the corner, right? So location isn't really a factor. God might call you to some great place halfway around the globe, or 400 to 600 miles away, or he might call you next door. Likelihood, Abraham being 75 years old at that point, over 100 by the time Isaac was actually born. So old age wasn't really a factor, right? The likelihood of a woman giving birth at that age wasn't a factor in God's calling. And the logic, right? Logically, sacrificing your son, killing your offspring, would really dampen the chances that you could populate the nations from your offspring, right? That the world would be blessed through your offspring. So logic isn't always a factor in God's calling. God calls, and all that other stuff isn't really matter if God's calling us to do something or calling us to go somewhere. And then lastly, God's call can really seem comical and even insane at times, right? At one point he says he laughs at God in Genesis chapter 17. Like, really? That's going to happen? 100-year-old man, 90-year-old woman? Yeah, right, God. Or insane, right? Genesis chapter 22. I want to read that verse again because that's just insane to think about, right? Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. That sounds absolutely insane for God to request that, right? And so God's calling can often seem comical or insane, but like I said, all these things didn't matter, right? God called Abram to this new land to populate the earth, to bless the nations through his offspring, to eventually give us all these great spiritual people and even Jesus from this. And we're like, okay. And we want to talk about the likelihood and the logic and the comicalness of it and the insanity of it. And none of that matters. If God has something that he wants to happen, it's going to happen, right? So it gets us to this question. This series is about what would so-and-so do, right? What would Abraham do? So how did Abraham respond to God? And I think it's interesting when we look at this, how he responded to God, because it's probably not what we normally would think of, right? He listened to God's promise. Okay. That's pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory, right? He believed. All right. So that's a good start, right? That's a good thing. Those are good godly things to do. Then he made his own plans in Genesis chapter 16, right? Hey, what if we did this? What if I slept with the maidservant? And then we had a child that way, and then we would have an offspring like God is talking about. So oftentimes when God's plans or calling is taking longer than we expect, we decide to make our own plans. That didn't work out for him, right? Then he laughed at God. That never works out for you. And then he listened to God's promise again in Genesis chapter 17. So God's like, all right, reel it back in. Here's the promise. Again, it's going to happen. And then he obeyed, even in the midst of insanity. We just read that in Genesis 22, verse 2. And then he trusted God to provide, which I think is a big one, right? So it's this progression. You can kind of see the thought processes of Abraham as he's kind of navigating this. He's like, all right, obey, believe, listen, make my own plans, try to do it my own way, laugh at God. Okay, God tells me again, and then obey again, and then trust God to provide. And so verse 8, Genesis 22, verse 8 says it this way. Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. Right? So eventually gets to this point. He's like, I don't know. God is calling me to sacrifice you, and I know God's going to provide somehow. He's going to make this work. He's going to come through in this situation. I'm just trusting that God will provide, which is that last little bit. So when you think of this question, what would Jesus do? Right? That was a popular phrase back in the day, and really still is, and something we try to live by. What would Abraham do? Well, we see Abraham would trust God even when it sounds crazy. He'd question God. He'd maybe even laugh at God when the promise didn't happen in a timely manner. He'd probably interject and try to make his own plans for the situation. He'd listen to the promise again. You know, sometimes it takes us multiple times to get it. And then he would obey to the point that it doesn't even make any sense. And then after all else fails, he would trust God to provide. Right? And these are great things, right? A lot of these are good things. A lot of these are like, okay, that's a human response, right? That's okay. We understand that. And it's funny to me that we hold Abraham in such high regard, right? He's like this giant of the Christian faith, and yet he wasn't perfect in following God, right? He didn't say, okay, that sounds crazy, but it's going to happen, and then just perfectly wait for God and let him do it, right? He tried to interject, he tried to laugh, he tried to question, and I think that's okay, right? That's the beauty of it. That's something that is okay. God is big enough for all of that, right? And so it's just a human response. And so he really just responded to God in much the same way that we all do, right? Now the key is not to stay away from all the questioning and laughing, that laughing phase, that questioning phase, or the thinking that God is absolutely insane. It's really moving and growing and maturing in our faith enough to know that even though there seems to be 100 logical reasons that something can't happen, or thousands logical reasons of why something can't happen, it's knowing that God does his best when it seems to be impossible, right? It's not saying, okay, we can never do these things. What would Jesus do? He would never question. What would Abraham do? He would never question. No, that's not true. Abraham would question. He'd laugh. He'd interject his own plans. But it's the moving forward. It's not staying in that phase, right? What if he laughed at God, tried to interject to make his own plans, and then never moved forward? It would be a totally different story, right? But he continues to move forward. And so it's not never struggling through those things. It's moving forward. Keep moving forward, right? It's knowing that God has done it before and believing that he can do it again, and do something crazy in our lives like he did for Abraham. It's moving from trying to make something happen in our lives and letting God do it in his timing. It's finally throwing in the towel and saying, okay, God, I trust you. I'm tired of trying to make it work myself, right? It's realizing that he's got this and trusting in him to the point that we would lose everything, right? For Abraham, it was his son, or the possibility of losing his son. What might it be for us? To just finally throw in the towel and say, okay, God, I understand your promises. They're going to come to fruition in my life. Let me just let you do your thing. Like I said, for Abraham, it was the possibility of losing his son. For us, what might it be? And so if Abraham were to give us his advice, or if we and we chose to live by his answers of what would Abraham do, it might look something like this, right? It might look like realizing that God calling us it's us realizing that God calling us leads to a meaningful relationship with God. The call of God leads to a meaningful relationship with God. If that's a better way to put it, kind of a weird phrase there. I'm sorry. It's, hey, realize that when God calls, it's best to just simply believe, right? Because Abraham tried to do all these other things, and yet what happened is exactly what God said was going to happen at the beginning if he just simply believed and just waited it out in God's timing. And then thirdly, we have to realize that God's plans are best even when we can't understand why. Right? I don't understand why you're asking me to sacrifice my son, but I know your plans are best. I don't understand why you're asking me to do X, Y, and Z, right? Why you're asking me to leave my family, move across the country. Why you're asking me to leave this job and go to another job, or leave this church and go to another church. It's realizing that God's plans are best even when we cannot understand why. And so, what would Abraham do? He'd realize that God's call leads us to meaningful relationship. That's best to just simply believe, and that his plans are best even when we don't understand why. This is what he would do, right? He would go through these same battles that all of us go through, right? He would navigate this difficult circumstance in his life just like most of us would. And so I think we often think, okay, these people are like spiritual giants. They got it all together, and I can't live up to that, right? What would Jesus do? Okay, you're right. You can't live up to that one. What would Abraham do? He'd do the same thing that a lot of us would do. And that's okay. That's okay. We should do really the same kind of things, right? We should be okay with struggling through those things. And then in the end, just realizing that God's call is the best. It leads us to meaningful relationship. It helps us believe. And we can realize that we need to trust in him even when we can't understand why. Abraham is a spiritual giant, and yet he reacts a lot like the rest of the humans of the world do. And so it's okay if we can't always live up to what would Jesus do. No, what would Abraham do? We can live up to that, right? It's a similar response to a lot of us. And so I hope that's an encouragement to you, right? That what would, all these big characters that we talk about had similar struggles that we have, right? And so it's okay to work through those things. And but also they came out on the other side, right? It's okay to work through those things, but it's not okay to just stay in that place, right? Come through on the other side and realize that God's got this, right? That God's got his plans are the best thing for us, that simply believing in him is the best thing we can do, and that all of that leads to meaningful relationship with him. And then we can get to that point of maybe not going through as much of those struggles and laughs and difficulties, trying to make it work in our own timing, in our own ways. Maybe we can do that less when we trust God more and more through all the difficulties in our life. And so I hope that's encouragement to you. Again, apologize for any difficulties with audio and things like that. But I do want to invite you guys next week. I want to invite you back to church next week. But also want to encourage everybody to sign up for Camp Bacon coming up September 23rd through 25th. It's a free camp for those out there listening. For 3rd through 12th graders, we need lots of help, lots of volunteers. Space is limited on that. We've gotten, I think, about 30 kids signed up at this point, and so it's really taken off and getting busy. And so get signed up as soon as you can, because we want you to be there, right? We don't want to have to turn people down. And so if you have any questions, you can text my number or call me on that page. If you need to sign up, just scan that QR code and it'll take you to the sign up link, or text me. I can send you that link as well. But definitely encourage your neighbors, friends, family, anybody like that to go to Camp Bacon. It's exciting week that we've been working on, and I know God's got great plans with that weekend. So like I said, get signed up for Camp Bacon. Invite y'all to be here Sunday for church, Bible class at 9, worship at 10 o'clock, and then Greg will be doing the live stream again next week, and so I invite you to join us for that as well. A lot of good things happening. Hope everyone's having a good week, going back to school, getting back in the groove of things. A lot of good stuff happening in the life of our church, and so we definitely encourage you to get involved in those. Appreciate everyone tuning in. Hope this lesson was meaningful for you, and we just pray you guys have a good week. Have a good night. We love you guys.